Hey guys, in this video I'll be covering some very useful base call abilities in the DFFOO global version of the game. Why base calls? Well, for starters, everyone actually can easily access any base call that they want. And I thought, considering that we'll be getting a lot of new players while we enter into the Shinryu era, I think it would be a good time to actually cover some very useful base calls even up till today. I really feel that base calls sometimes don't get enough attention or the credit that they deserve because many people often forego them in favor of LD call abilities. Depending on the fight, base calls can provide a good source of so-called budget utility. Note that I will only be covering base calls here and not LD call abilities. And I also want to quickly mention that I will be also taking the call ability descriptions from the Cydia compendium, and I'll also be including a link in the video description to the compendium itself, so you can check that out if you need further information. In terms of acquiring the actual base call of a character, it is actually fairly simple. First of all, you obviously need to acquire said character. Many of the characters you can actually unlock just by going through the story chapter or doing that character's lost chapter event. There are also, of course, however, characters that were introduced into the game through special events, and those events are limited time only. However, you can still access those limited time characters. All you need to do is actually just use 10 power tokens to buy that character's 15 CP weapon, and the moment you acquire any weapon of that character, you will also unlock that character for your roster. Once you have acquired the character, all you need to do is level the character to C level 75 to unlock the use of their base call ability, but I do recommend to go all the way to C level 80 because that provides an upgrade to that character's base call ability. You can get the required crystals from the Cactua crystal quest. The first character, or rather two characters that I want to mention, is Ceodore and Enna. I put both of them together because their base calls are pretty similar. The main utility from having both of them is that they enchant the caller with their respective elements. So for example, if you use Ceodore base call, the caller will get Holy Enchant, and if you use the Enna base call, the caller will get both Holy and Dark Enchant. On top of the caller enchant, both of these calls also inflict imperils of their respective elements. So using the Ceodore base call will inflict Holy Imperil, and if you use the Enna base call, you will actually inflict a debuff that has both Holy and Dark Imperil. In a vacuum, this can be quite useful because there are not many characters that can actually enchant or imperil Holy. Although the duration is pretty short, what you can do is slap these call abilities on characters who do off-turn damage such as Kain or Cisne or Freya, and then have turn Hoggers go wild, and this will actually trigger the off-turn damage that is also enchanted by these base calls. Next up is Lenna, and Lenna may actually be one of the candidates for best base call in the game. As far as I know, she is the only base call that provides your entire party with 100% debuff evasion. Her base call also provides some additional bonuses such as HP and Brave Regen, but the really key reason why you bring Lenna is really just for the debuff evasion that she provides. While debuff evasion will not work against guaranteed hit debuffs because those circumvent evasion, having this can really help protect your party across some fights where there are very crippling debuffs that can be cast on your party. Next up is both Faris and Vanille. I put both of these characters together because the utility of their base calls are pretty similar. So when you use Vanille base call, she dispels 6 buffs from all targets, and if you use Faris base call, she will dispel all buffs on all targets as well as inflict a range of debuffs as well, such as poison, max brave down, attack down, and defense down. In Faris's case, if you also happen to have unlocked her LD and her LD bots, using her base call would actually also inflict her LD debuff on all enemies as well, for a total of 5 debuffs. Now just on first glance, it may seem that Faris is probably the overall better base call compared to Vanille. However, there can be situations where you want to bring Vanille. For example, there may be certain party compositions that you actually do not want to inflict so many debuffs because there's only a limit of 8 debuffs that you can inflict in total. In those circumstances, you probably want to bring Vanille instead of Faris as your main call dispeller. Next up, I have Bartz. Now Bartz functions a little bit similarly to Ceodore and Enna that I mentioned earlier, in that using his base call will enchant the caller with 6 turns of wind enchant. However, I didn't include Bartz together with the other 2 characters because his imperil acts very differently. Bartz's wind imperil is tied to an aura, which also means that it doesn't take up any debuff slots on the enemies, and his wind imperil actually will still stick even if the enemies are immune to any form of elemental imperil. Historically, there has been stages where bosses are immune to all forms of elemental imperil, and in those stages, when you bring Bartz as a base call, you still inflict the wind imperil to those bosses. Next up, in the form of brave damage mitigation, we have Celes and Zack base calls. Both of them function very similarly. First of all, using either of their base calls will inflict the lock-on debuff on all enemies for 4 turns. Importantly, using the Celes base call also grants the caller 6 turns of her trademark runic ability, which allows the caller to actually absorb magical brave damage. Zack's call can be considered the physical counterpart to Celes's base call, in that he actually reduces physical brave damage rather than magical brave damage. Although Zack's base call doesn't actually absorb the damage, he does cut down physical brave damage by 50%. Next is actually one of my favorite calls, and that is the Setzer base call. And in my opinion, he's also a top contender for best base calls in the game alongside with Lenna. Setzer's base call is very straightforward. When you use it, you battery the entire party and you also inflict 2 turns of freeze debuff on all enemies. The freeze debuff in DFFOO is a debuff that prevents all forms of brave gains, which means that once this debuff lands on the enemies, their current brave will not go any higher. This also means that as long as the enemies are at 0 brave and they have this debuff on, any of their attacks will not deal any HP damage to you, since their current brave will not go any higher and HP damage is based on their current brave. Next up are Fuujin, Lulu and Rydia, and here I put 3 characters together because their base calls function very similarly. All 3 of these base calls will imperil their corresponding element, so Fuujin will imperil wind to all enemies, Lulu will imperil fire, and Rydia will imperil water, and this is done through a debuff on all enemies. At the same time, these 3 call abilities will also enchant your entire party, so not just the caller but actually the entire party itself with their respective elements as well. So this will actually allow you to hit elemental weakness for a short amount of time. In Fuujin's and Lulu's case, their LD calls actually also provide elemental enchant and imperil, so if you do happen to have their LDs, you can then have longer duration of their elemental enchant and imperil. In Rydia's case, her LD call ability actually provides another form of utility, in that it also provides the party 3 turns of evasion, but I won't go any further details into that since that is an LD call and not base call. Next up, we have Yuna. Yuna's base call at C level 80 has the utility of cleansing all existing party debuffs. So beyond Lenna, this is another call ability that helps you to manage debuffs, but the mechanic behind it is a bit different. Lenna prevents new debuffs from being inflicted, whereas Yuna cleanses current debuffs on the party. Beyond that, Yuna's base call also has the added utility of extending party's buffs by one turn, and depending on your party setup and the fight, this extension, even though it's only one turn, may actually come in handy as well. For example, you can actually extend Lulu's Fire Enchant or Rydia's Water Enchant buffs, or if for example you have Selfie in the party and her valuable aura buff is up, that buff can also be extended by Yuna's base call. Last but certainly not least is Arciela. Arciela's base call inflicts a very nice debuff called HP Attack Disable, or sometimes referred to by players as HP Silence. As long as this debuff remains on enemies, they actually cannot use any HP attacks on your party. If they are scripted to do an HP attack, what will happen is that they will actually just skip their turn, similar to how stuns or paralysis works. Do take note though that HP Attack Disable will not work against trigger HP attacks, which are attacks that gets triggered whenever bosses go through a certain HP threshold, because those are considered as trigger attacks and not actual abilities of the bosses. For those not aware, this debuff from Arciela's base call can also fulfill the conditional on the recently released Camelonauts FR, which requires you to attack the enemy while they have a form of disable on them, and this debuff fulfills that conditional. In any case, this is the end of this video, so as always, if you enjoy the content, please leave a like, comment or subscribe. It really helps a lot. Till then, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!